Okay, welcome to this debate between myself, Matt Sands from the Nations of Sanity, and Adam Kokesh. Just before I hand over to Adam to introduce himself and give his side of the argument on this debate, I'm just going to very quickly introduce myself and the Nations of Sanity and what our debate is actually about. Basically, the Nations of Sanity, which is what I'm representing, asserts that the only way to create a truly free society is to establish the non-aggression principle as the law, which we propose doing through a three-part peace agreement. And just before I hand it over to Adam, I think anyone watching this who's not familiar with what the non-aggression principle is, I think it's a good idea to just very briefly go through that. So basically, the non-aggression principle is a principle that prohibits the initiation of force against peaceful people, and basically defines crime by whether or not you're causing harm or loss to another, or whether you're at least threatening or attempting to. Would you agree with that definition, Adam?
Yeah, close enough.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's good. If I may, I think there's one other thing that's sort of worth establishing here, that is the commonality in our philosophical foundation, that this is based in self-ownership, and that self-ownership gives us ethics, and that the non-aggression principle is one way of capturing the set of ethics that go along with this observation of reality as a singular doctrine.
Yeah, I'd go along with that. Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, we both identify as voluntarists, so I'm sure we'll be pretty much in agreement on the non-aggression principle, both with regards to what it is and its value and its what I would characterise it as universal morality that it represents. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we would probably be united on that, but I just thought for anyone else that might be listening, just to let them know that when we refer to the non-aggression principle, that's what we're talking about. It's worth pointing out, anyone who's not familiar with it, that it's not a pacifist principle. It doesn't prohibit the use of force, it prohibits the initiation of force. So you can still use force as defence, but you should not initiate force against peaceful people who are not themselves aggressing against anyone. And as I say, my side of the subject of this debate is my assertion, and the assertion of the Nations of Sanity is that the only way to create voluntarism or a free society is to establish the non-aggression principle as law through a three-part peace agreement. Adam disagrees with that, and he has his own methodology for creating a free society, and I'm going to hand over to Adam now to introduce himself briefly and his side of that argument.
Well, thanks, Matt, and I don't anticipate this being much of a debate of animosity, at least, and it is really cool that we're able to just explore this idea and it's sort of a how do we apply these ideas conversation, and how do we strategically implement them kind of conversation. And so for people who don't know anything about me, I've been a full-time activist for 11 years. Before that, I was in the Marine Corps, which led me to join Iraq Veterans Against the War. And that's how I fell over backwards into full-time activism, ending up running for Congress in New Mexico in 2010, endorsed by Ron Paul as a Republican. Yes, I was a Republican there briefly. I'm sorry about that. I'm better now. Thank you very much for asking. But I then couldn't shut up when the race was over, so I got a radio show. That was the birth of Adam versus the Man on AM 1550 KIV, more positive talk radio Albuquerque. And right when I was getting canceled because I didn't want to sell ads, I just wanted to rant about politics and philosophy and making the world a better place, I got picked up as a TV show with the Russians on Russia Today. And for 4 months, I was on the bottom rung of the legitimate television ladder before getting canceled for political reasons, and went independent online. Got a YouTube channel up to 70 million views, focusing on my podcast now, focused on Steemit, steemit.com. Highly recommend this as a blockchain-based social media website. But also I am running for president, and I do cringe a little bit every time I have to say it like that, because I don't think there's anything more unlibertarian or anti-freedom that you could possibly say than, I want to be president of the United States. I want to be in charge of this giant violent monopoly and force my views and policies on an entire country. No. I am running to be the bankruptcy agent of the federal government. More than running for president, I'm running for not president, and I'm running to turn the presidential election into a referendum on whether or not the federal government should be allowed to exist at all. And what we're offering is, for the first time in American history, a real choice for the American people. You can vote for a Republican schmuck or a Democrat schmuck, or this exact plan that we will have laid out in advance. And that kind of gets me to the strategy, if I may transition directly into the meat of this, and that is the strategy of how we deal with the current institutions of government in a way that provides for a peaceful, orderly transition to a voluntary society. Obviously, I think we would agree that fundamentally what we are doing is more evolutionary than revolutionary, and that it's based on human trends. It's not based on, hitting a breaking point, although there may be breaking points along the way. That this is the realization of the next step of human enlightenment. That humanity has become more ethical over time, more peaceful, and, don't hit, don't steal, don't kill. We generally embrace that as a society in a way that we never did before, but we make this exception for government. And so when it comes to your proposition, and I will address this specifically and then hand it over to you, is that the proposition that the non-aggression principle needs to be made law in order to achieve a voluntary society. There are a lot of definitional things that need to be teased out in that, and the ideal of a voluntary society is an ideal, first of all. And I've made this point before, that we can have a stateless society. We can have a society with no institutions of coercion. We can have where anything that we would call a government would be voluntary. We could get to that point. But the moment that someone gets drunk at a bar and punches someone in the face, for the victim, it's not a voluntary moment in their life. It's not a voluntary world that they're living in. So it is important to point out that there's this ideal that we are both advocating, and then there is a practical implication of the idea. And we may get to the point where people just don't feel the need to drink anymore and punch people in the face, or we have force fields, and it's true that aggression will continue its decline of a kind of radioactive decay curve and eventually become negligible. But even before we get to that far-flung future where things are fundamentally changed by technology, and really, in a sense, you could say that's true about the present day, the idea of having the NAP as law is not necessary. First of all, because we get an effectively voluntary society just when we get government down to we'll get rid of the federal government, the state governments, and county governments, and then you've got city states and communities, and people can break off and be sovereign on their own property. But also, even getting rid of that transitional, thing that I'm advocating for localization, you don't need the non-aggression principle as a universal agreement to get to that at least stateless, effectively voluntary society, because all you have to do is get to the critical mass where people don't tolerate government. They don't tolerate institutional coercion. And at that point, people will have the better nonviolent mechanisms of coming together. So even if there are people who disagree with the non-aggression principle, we'll handle them better without government, and you don't need the law for them to sign it. You don't need them to engage in it. You just need it to make sure that there's a critical mass of the population that will never give its support to a coercive institution.
Okay. I see where you're coming from. Just to clarify a few points with regards to establishing the NAPA's law and what that entails and what that means, because I can sympathise with you a little bit with regards to using the things like the word president and running for president, with regards to anarchist principles. It almost seems oxymoronic, and I get a similar reaction from people when I talk about establishing the non-aggression principles law, or from anarchists at least, because anarchists here
laws a trigger word for some people.
Yeah, it is, and people because the problem is people associate law with government, and then from then on associate it with ruling and oppressing people. The reason why establishing and first of all, I just want to clarify as well, the way we would establish the non-aggression principles law is through a peace agreement. So it'd basically be like the terms of peace, rather than it being established and enforced through a government mechanism. And one of the things about having the non-aggression principles law is governments themselves as ruling entities would be illegal. because obviously, that, as we both I think appreciate, they do violate the non-aggression principle pretty much by definition. So that's one thing that needs to be clarified. The other thing as well, which I point out to people when they object to the idea of law as anarchists, is the beauty of the non-aggression principle is enforcing it doesn't involve the initiation of force. It may involve force, but only as an act of defence, and it doesn't require the power to rule people. If I say to you, I'm going to use force to stop you from robbing and raping and murdering and assaulting other people, I'm not ruling you, I'm not violating your freedom anyway. But if I say I'm going to use force to stop you smoking weed or gambling or all the other millions of things that are illegal in various parts of the world, then I am attempting to rule you, and I am violating your freedom, and I am oppressing you. So one of the reasons why I feel like the non-aggression principle needs to be established as law is partly because it can be without contradiction. You can establish the non-aggression principle as law through a peace agreement, and if it's universally applied, then there is no one would have any right that anyone else has. People talk about, like, well, what about the people that enforce the non-aggression principle? You know, assuming that you'd have like a police-like organisation that would be dedicated to doing so. My point to that is, yes, but those organisations don't have any special rights or powers. They might be better equipped to do it if they're dedicated, but any individual person can enforce the non-aggression principle, because, as I say, the non-aggression principle is just an act of defence. The reason why I think we do need to establish it as law is because, as much as I'm happy for people to agree to disagree on everything, and I'm not saying everyone has to agree to the non-aggression principle, but the non-aggression principle does define what is a crime. And if it defines what's a crime, then I think we need to establish that and have it down so that we're on the same page as to what is a crime and what's not a crime. I mean, if we can't unite people on anything else, and we probably won't, we should at least be able to unite people on what is and isn't a crime, because ultimately that is the cause of conflict, and ultimately that is how governments and other organisations are able to get away with such crime in this world.
So there's another possibility of how we achieve what you seem to be looking to achieve as a certain market function with what you're calling the law of the non-aggression principle and the three-part agreement. And it seems much more likely to be implemented. And this is not from my own theorizing or my own ideas, but from having seen so many others present this. And what I see, first of all, in looking at the present day is that most people already have that kind of understanding of agreement. We don't, like, when you go into, you know, a deli to buy a sandwich, you don't have to say, do you agree to not rip me off and punch me in the face and violate my self-ownership? No, like, and a lot of other philosophers have made the point before is that, you know, this is everyday anarchy, is that most people are voluntarists in their regular lives, that is, you know, what we have achieved already is an expectation of ethical behavior from our fellow human beings. And it's just that we don't have a very good method or mechanism of holding people accountable, because all we have, at least primarily, what we think of turning to is government for accountability for transgressions, and it's not very effective. But to really take a more inclusive view, you realize that the more effective check or determinant on people's behaviors is the market signals that are the response to those behaviors. When people do something that people don't like, it ends up hurting their economic status. And so already when you say when we need to have the NAP as a rule of law or as a specific agreement, I would say, like, you know, we already have it for most people, and it's not going to come to become a universal thing from, you know, a bunch of people signing on to it. Although if you want to use that as an outreach mechanism, I think that's great. I think that's one of the reasons I love the Libertarian Party. It's because the Libertarian Party, when you join the LP, you actually have to check a box that says on your membership form, whether it's online or in person, everybody has to do this. It says, I oppose the initiation of force to achieve political or social goals. I mean, right there, you could say, hey, well, that's the agreement. That's the assertion. You know, maybe you want it in a more specific form, but here's what I'm getting at is that what's more realistic is that instead of, hey, we're going to get everybody to sign the NAP Peace Pledge, is that you'll see the continual development of contracts in dispute resolution services as government becomes more irrelevant in our lives, as the government legal services, the justice services become more out of reach for people, we see more community-based adjudication, we see more mandatory arbitration written into contracts, things like that. And eventually you're going to see the development of what I'm sure you've heard people like Stefan Molyneux theorize on, and many others with him, that there are the insurance, there's the possibility that insurance companies are going to take on a lot more of these functions. So you don't have to sign, I agree to the non-aggression principle, because that's actually relatively narrow. That's just one line of the spectrum of possibility of things that you can respond to with market mechanisms. And so you're going to have a much more rich and complex set of agreements that determine human conduct, of which the non-aggression principle is an obvious underlying factor, because they all have to be based on the natural law, on voluntary agreement. But that's the state of reality. That's, in a sense, libertarianism is descriptive, not prescriptive. It just describes, hey, when you use violence, it's bad for people. The prescription is, if you want things to be good for people, stop using violence. Stop using government and coercion and institutionalized force. And then if you go, well, what is the natural market trend of human history? It's to progress and efficiency and productivity and greater cooperation and greater harmony and less violence.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I've heard that sort of argument put forward before, and I see a couple of problems with it. First of all, I do agree to a certain extent that, I agree fully that the non-aggression principle does represent what most people implicitly understand as basic morality anyway. So there is a certain implicit acceptance there. I'm not so convinced that we can rely on that. But I do agree that, one of the reasons why I think this is the way to unite people is because I think it represents a true common ground. I think for as divided as people are on so many other things, I think most common decent people, when questioned directly on this about, do you think it's wrong to initiate force on peaceful people, would agree that of course it is. It's almost like it would be common sense to them. Although sadly, I think we live in a world that shows that it's not so common, that kind of common sense. But the problem with that is, as much as the market may have a sort of self-policing mechanism within it with regards to, people that do this will be shunned by society, when it comes to crime, that's not enough. We can encourage behaviour that we deem good from a subjective morality point of view. Like, we all have our own preferences and ideals, and we can encourage that. We can form voluntary societies where people voluntarily agree to be part of those sort of standards, those more specific standards. But outside of those more specific standards, I think we need to have lines. I think we need to have limits of tolerance, and clearly drawn out limits of tolerance, to state that this is where we won't accept, and we won't just let the market shun you and let society kind of try and curb your behaviour in that way. If you actually commit a crime, then force will be used against you. It's not enough to just shun a rapist, is it? It's not enough to just say, well, we'll let him slowly get poor as people won't want to do business with him because of the way he behaves. No, we will use force to stop him. And we would be totally within our rights to, and it would be totally consistent with the non-aggression principle, to use force to stop a rapist from raping. And the same goes for every violation of the non-aggression principle. Obviously, rape's a more severe example, but it helps get the point across. But you can apply the same principle to everything that's a violation of the non-aggression principle. As I say, the NAP, and I think for shortness I'll call it the NAP from now on, as it's less of a mouthful than non-aggression principle, but the NAP does define what crime is. And if the NAP defines what crime is, then I think we should enforce it as law.
Well, again, the question is, what is the mechanism of we in building that consensus? Now, if what you're doing with Nations of Sanity is using this as a platform to say, look, here's a hypothetical. If we got everybody to sign on to this, we'd be there. We wouldn't have to deal with all these other problems. And if you apply that strategy more effectively, and you beat me to localizing government with developing a global consensus on the non-aggression principle through a pledged kind of thing, then I have no problem with that. I think that's awesome. I think that's great. And I wouldn't do anything to slow you down or stop you or hinder you in any way. I would support you in that effort. The disagreement here is just that whether you say, when you say that it's necessary, I believe I've sufficiently proven that there are at least two other realistic alternatives that achieve the same goal that would make it unnecessary entirely. That if we got government all the way down to the community level and it was effectively voluntary, there would be very little incentive to be pushing this particular agreement. If we got to a society that was well organized through insurance companies and dispute resolution organizations that were capable of using force in an organized way that was non-coercive, that was purely protective, defensive, and compliant with the NAP, then also you wouldn't need that. And I think both of those scenarios are much more likely to achieve it. So it really then comes down to, what is the most effective bang for the buck? And I do believe that we are much smaller as a movement than we should be right now. We are in the, I don't know, in different parts of the world, but in the United States, if you really want to count as conscientious philosophical libertarians, I think 1% of the population would be generous, and that would be 3.3 million or so. And I would guess that if you added up the rest of the world together, it might be twice that we have a third of the philosophical libertarians. It might be even a lot more than that proportionately here in the United States. And, that being said, we have a long way to go. I think we should be about 10% of the population. And what I mean by that is that, in a sense, we don't need to be to achieve the political consensus to localize government, but also that, in a sense, we never will be. You look at even the bullshit left-right spectrum in the United States, liberals and conservatives. Yes, a majority of the population still identifies as Democrat or Republican. There are more independents generally than either of those two parties. But in terms of people who actually identify in an ideological sense as conservatives or liberals, like, I read liberal books and conservative books and I consume the media and I think of this mentality and it's important to me. That's a very, very small part of the population. That's probably somewhere around 10%. And I think it's only about that many who will be in this sort of class of early adopters of libertarianism, who are sort of the low-hanging fruit, who will think analytically, who will think critically, who will think philosophically, who will think from a perspective of consistent ethics. And when we, until we get to that point, it is kind of silly to do anything other than let's grow the movement as fast as we can. Let's win as many converts as fast as we can. And I think with what we're doing in the political realm with this campaign is an incredible amount of bang for the buck. That you get, when you say you're running for president, you file the paperwork, you get to start talking to people you would never talk to otherwise. You get to insert yourself into conversations that you would never have a say in if you didn't put your name on the list and make yourself a threat. So I think these are synergistic strategies. And what I do with my campaign is I simultaneously promote the platform of the practical application of these principles, but I also promote the philosophy, the worldview, and the lifestyle of ethics and conscientious living that goes along with that. So if what you're doing in seeking people to get people to sign a pledge to make it a law, I probably would even sign on myself.
Yeah, I do understand that your disagreement isn't necessarily opposition to my idea, but rather a disagreement that it's the way to go. Yeah, I do appreciate that. So, and I appreciate you clarifying that as well. That
there's one other specific thing, Matt, is that you say that it's necessary, and that I really do have a disagreement with, and I would never even be able to say that about anything that I'm doing. And I think this is a really important note of humility for all of us to have in our activism, to know that none of us has the one answer. And I know that I'm pursuing this political thing, and I'm showing out that there's this opportunity that it could go this way. There could be a widespread collapse first. It could be that cryptocurrency takes the Fed out from underneath the system and all fiat currencies go away, and politics is totally irrelevant because blockchain everything. It could be, it could be so many other different ways. It could be through agorism, although I think I can prove that that's not going to do it by itself. It could be technology. It could be just that we innovate our way out of the state. And libertarians are the ones going, I told you so, 10 years from now when self-driving cars end the drug war, right? Because that's what's going to happen. Self-driving cars are going to end the drug war. The human product, without traffic stops, 90% of drug arrests go away.
Okay. But you're not removing the law, though, are you?
Right. No, hold on. I'm not saying this is like decisively. It's not like, but no, think about it. We already have the technology for self-driving cars. The only reason that we haven't fully implemented them globally, because they would be more efficient, more effective in so many ways, is because government is slowing this process down. But if we just had self-driving cars, think about how much of the police state and the drug war goes away. So much what's left is negligible. How many more resources are freed up? What's going to end the welfare state is not that a bunch of libertarians, convince people that the invisible hand was the way to go in guiding the economy. No, it's gonna happen because technology makes us so productive and makes quality of life so great that we go, yeah, just take care of people. That's what most Americans' attitude is towards the government and the welfare state today. Like, well, I don't care if you take 30, because they don't realize it's 50% of their income for the average working American, but take 30% of my income. I don't care. I'm happy. I have enough for myself. Let the government take care of poor people. It's when we have just superfluously better mechanisms of achieving all of those things that the state will be irrelevant. And that's coming. That's another big part of the change that's happening is technology is accelerating with Moore's law. Exponentially. It's just that artificial intelligence is going to drive productivity and communications, connectedness, understanding. Like the idea of government is people aren't going to care anymore. Like we're here railing against this like it's some great evil already. I look at Trump's intervention in Syria and I'm excited about the fact that he can get away with so little. That in Korea, we're coming to the end of the Korean War. This is like, and Trump gets to take credit for that. And that's kind of depressing. But, that's kind of how it's going to go. Like, oh, no, yeah, we don't really have the excuse of Korea working on nuclear weapons anymore to justify the American nuclear arsenal. Like one thing by one thing by one thing by one thing, eventually, the state is going to wither away even without any deliberate activism.
Just to touch on the Syria point, I don't want to go on to too many specifics, but the Syria point, I mean, doesn't that also demonstrate, because I'm assuming that you're referring to the fact that Trump's had very little public support for it, even from many of his followers?
Well, no, I mean, actually get away with so little. It is really a relatively limited strike, and I don't want to demean, I don't want to demean the cost of the war as a whole, because you could give Trump and Obama especially, a lot of credit over 7 years for 500,000 people dead in Syria with all the ways that they've manipulated the situation, funding through State Department, through Defense Department, through, who knows what other foreign channels they have of getting money to the terrorists and the rebels who are standing up to the tyrant Assad. But compare it to... Just go back in history. This is where I love citing the work of Steven Pinker, who has proven academically, a Harvard professor, that along with the incline of technology, we've seen a decline in violence, that there's a very clear trend there. So you compare even the global war on terror, of which I'm a veteran, which is horrific, not as bad as Vietnam, not as bad as World War II, not as bad as the era of World War I. Like over time, what governments can get away with war gets less and less and less because you can't lie to people and get away with it the way that you used to be able to in the age of the internet. How long have they been trying to get a war going with Iran? They can't convince the American people to support it. Even Syria. I was in jail in 2013, 5 years ago, when Obama was trying to get boots on the ground in Syria, and what stopped it was, those active duty guys online with these silly little, social media placards that said, "I did not enlist to fight for Al Qaeda in Syria." You just can't get away with the lies anymore. And in the age of the internet, you look at like the demilitarized zone in Korea and you go, how in the hell are we still doing this stupid shit? Like, how old are you, Matt?
37.
Okay, so we're almost the exact same age. I'm 36. So if you think about, we grew up with the internet. Like, as the internet was growing up, we were growing up. But the kids who grew up with it already in place, the people like one generation younger than us, they don't have any, and even though I like to call myself a millennial because I'm on the edge, but that's kind of cheating, like right on the in between generations. So I identify with the younger one, with the millennials. But like they look at this shit and they're just like, whatever, this is dumb. There's no tolerance for problems that exist for lack of information. And so many of the problems allegedly solved by government are just, information problems that are way better resolved by voluntary solutions in the market. And for the first time in human history, the acceleration of that capacity is not just competing with government, it's leapfrogging it. That's, Lyft and Uber versus the taxi medallion systems of government. It's the internet versus government control of newspapers and television and radio.
Okay, yeah. Perhaps when it comes to appraising the situation with regards to what the government can get away with and stuff like that, I might be guilty of a little bit of the glass is half empty, whereas you're looking at it half full kind of perspective on that. I think
you can't drink the empty part.
True. But I think it's a little bit more debatable than what you're stating with regards to things getting better and the government getting away with less. Although I do see your point to a certain extent with regards to obviously the internet, the age of information. It's harder for them to fool us. It's harder for them to fool us. And I think with regards to the amount of backlash Trump has had, even from his own supporters, with regards to Syria, is probably something that's tempered exactly how far he's gone with that. At the same time, you could also look at it and think, well, even with such a wide dissemination of information, even with so few people supporting such things, they still do it and they still get away with it. And it may be worse in a less informed society where we didn't have things like the internet allowing us better access to information. So that may well be true. And I can certainly see your logic with regards to the natural progression. I think you touched on what is the crux of our debate, and that is the real core of where we disagree. Because although I do appreciate the fact that you don't outright oppose, what I'm suggesting, the disagreement is over my assertion that it is necessary. And I do. Just to confirm, I do think that it is necessary. I do, as much as I applaud your actions with regards to being more tangible, because there's a lot of great libertarian thinkers out there that argue the principles and make very good cases. But you're probably the only one I can think of who's actually pursuing a tangible course, something that's actually, look, this is actual direct action. This is actually something we can do, or that we're going to at least try to do, rather than just, debating principles all day and what have you. And you are also right that the libertarian movement or the freedom movement or anarchist movement or the voluntarist movement, whatever you want to call it, it is far too divided. It's not big enough because not necessarily working against each other, but I don't think there's enough unity. Perhaps it's partly down to a lot of anarchists are very individualistic and opposed to any form of collectivism, even voluntary forms. Again, it's why many of them revile at the idea of you running for president, that would revile when I talk about laws being established. It's kind of a reaction against, I think, that kind of collectivist, anything that they think is connected to collectivism. But the problem is, and I like I say, I do see where you're coming from, but the problem is, and if I can stretch a metaphor a little bit, like what you're doing with regards to looking to dissolve the federal government. Now, I realise that's not your end game, but that's obviously your first step. And like I say, it's something direct and something tangible that people can, get behind and support. But the problem is the way I look at it, it's kind of like defeating this giant slave fortress without actually abolishing slavery. That's kind of like the way I look at it metaphorically with regards to removing government without establishing voluntarism, as I say, through establishing the non-aggression principles law.
So can I point out that one other thing that's really, to me, critically important about localization, and I think this not only makes it a more efficient strategy of getting us to at least localize government where we can have the full transition to a voluntary society, but there's a sort of harm reduction approach to this as well. I'm not willing to sit by while the drug war is still happening globally. I'm not willing to stand by while militarism is still, ruining lives on a daily basis, where government regulation squanders opportunity and creates just an incredible inefficiency from top to bottom in any society unfortunate enough to have one. And what localization does is immediately reduce those harms. You're not going to see military adventurism from 50 states being independent the way that you do with the military, industrial, media, congressional complex running the show in Washington. You're not going to have a drug war where you end up with 2 million Americans behind bars all the time. Like, that's just not going to happen. And we shouldn't have to just hold out for the ideal or for winning over a critical mass of the population in terms of converting them to say, look, I don't care if you're libertarian or not. If you're just a common sense, ethical person, let's get away from this destructiveness. And if we want to provide leadership as libertarians, we can't just say, well, you better read a bunch of books by Rothbard, and you better study this and that, and you better read all these websites and understand this philosophy, and you better agree with me on this and be ready to, debate intellectual. No, screw that. It's like, hey, how do we make it as easy as possible for you? Come out and vote once, and it might be the last time you ever have to vote in an American federal election. Come out and just vote to localize government until we finish this process, and that'll really minimize the role of government in your life. That's, to me, the greater immediate practical promise of libertarianism and localization, as opposed to arguing ideals and philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, I follow your logic on that. The problem is I think, with regards to like you say, not everyone has to be on the same page with all their ideals and values and things like that. Again, there's a subjective morality that we all have that differs from person to person, and within groups and from group to group and all of that. And I understand that. And I mean, I kind of have that. It's the same thinking that makes me just double down on my assertion that I think the non-aggression principle needs to be established as law, because I think you need to separate what we can agree to disagree on and just, but for sure try to influence people and encourage people to live a better way. But I think we need to separate those areas that we can encourage and try to influence on the areas where we can actually draw a line and say, no, you do not get to do that. We will use force to stop you. Here, we don't think that's a great idea, but, you're free as free individuals to do what you want. But here's the line you don't cross. And I think we need to draw that line. I think if we don't draw that line, the whole thing's too vague, and we leave ourselves too vulnerable to that old ideology of might makes right, which is pretty much what gave birth to government rule in the first place. I think that will just come back as a dominant force if we do not draw. I mean, just to very, very briefly go through what the three-part agreement is that I mentioned. The three-part agreement is, part one is just the basic agreement of establishing the non-aggression principle as law. Part two is called lines in the sand, and that's where you draw the limits of tolerance on all areas where there's room for interpretation, like grey areas, for example. And then part three is to establish rightful ownership, because if we're not on the same page over who owns what, there's little point us having a law that prohibits theft. And just going back to part two, the importance of that, and this is kind of the crux of why I think establishing the non-aggression principle as law is necessary, not just the best way to go, but I actually think it's an essential part of defining a free society, and the only way we can truly have one is because you need those lines, you need those limits of tolerance, and we need to have them actually so people know people need to know where they stand, people need to know what the limits are. And like I say, there's still a big world of subjective morality that we can agree to disagree on, but we need to separate that from things that we don't agree to disagree on. I might think that it's wrong to have sex before marriage, but I'm not going to enforce those views on you. That's, you might think it's different. I don't feel that way, but people have this is an example of subjective moralities, people's personal ideals on how they think you should live your life. But I don't think we can have the same approach to that as we have to something like murder, rape, theft, assault, all the things that are violations of the non-aggression principle, because those are crimes. Those are areas where we can and should use force to stop them. And like I say, I think if we can unite... Sorry.
Yeah, no, there's still a major problem with that when we say should. To be potentially morally justified is not the same as should. If a child is pickpocketing you, should you shoot him in the face? No, definitely not. You would hypothetically, yes, you would be right to, but I would rather shun someone who uses, excessive force and retaliation because they think that they're justified because the non-aggression principle gave them carte blanche, and that's definitely not the case. So there's a greater force here that is the market and the whole range of potential responses that you're not only ignoring, you're almost denying people's freedom to participate in, because you're saying that there are these lines that are like, absolute, thou shalt not cross, and if you cross, we should use force against you. But that's not always the case. And it's in violation of my right to say, if someone steals from me, I might just let it go. It says I have the right to decide it's not worth it. I wish I had an insurance company that was insured me against any such theft, and I would be instantly compensated. But then the insurance company would be able to, through its determination of market forces and incentives, say, well, this guy stole a briefcase with $1 million in it, and we're going to send a couple SWAT teams after him because it's worth a few $10,000 of investment to retrieve that money. But if he stole your TV. Your TV got stolen out of your living room. Will you pay insurance for that? If we find the TV, we'll claim it. Maybe we will with our high-tech solutions at that point. And I'm speaking obviously in the voice of the insurance company at this point. But no, Mr. Sands, we're just going to give you a TV back. We're not going to go hunt down your neighbor because he might have stolen your TV. It's just not worth it.
Yeah, but for one thing, the non-aggression principle would established as law wouldn't deny you the freedom to make those decisions with regards to if you want to let someone go because they've stolen from you or whatever. For one thing, you can just give them retrospective permission to have whatever they stole, and then they haven't stolen, and it's not a crime, and what have you. As the victim, you would have that right. But the point you made about shooting someone who pickpocketed you, I actually think demonstrates my point a little bit, because that's why we need boundaries. That's why because the problem is, as much as the non-aggression principle is a pretty objective principle, it's a pretty black and white as a principle, there are grey areas. There are areas where the lines are a bit fuzzy. And I'm not saying you draw a specific line that everyone has to follow. I'm saying you draw two lines of tolerance in either direction that establishes what the grey area is and what the black and white is. If I could just give an example to illustrate what I'm talking about. Let's take, for example, the non-aggression principle demands that all adults have full self-ownership over themselves, and they can consent to legal contracts, sex, drugs with other consenting adults. But obviously it's a different issue with children because they can't give informed consent for these things, which is why, sex with a child would be rape and a legal contract would be invalid and what have you. Now, the non-aggression principle is pretty clear just as a principle, and part one of the agreement I refer to would set that. But what it wouldn't do is say, well, when does a child become an adult? When does one become another? Where do we draw the line? And you can't draw an exact line because there is room for debate. Is a 17-year-old an adult? Is an 18-year-old an adult? You can. There's a lot of leeway you can kind of debate in both directions on that. But there has to be a limit. You can't have someone saying, well, this 6-year-old's an adult, and therefore I can have sex with her because she said yes, and what have you. You can't have that. You have to have a limit to what. Like I say, you have to have a limit to where we would agree to disagree, and within that limit,
hold on. There's a slightly less offensive example if you want to make this point, because it also
extreme.
Well, hold on. It also addresses the issue of property rights in a very direct way. So, let's take land, for example. One of the things that is not recognized enough by libertarians is that if you own yourself, and you can own property from mixing your labor with natural resources, then one of your rights as a human being is equitable access to natural resources. Now, what is equitable? That obviously becomes subjective and determined by the market. So when I bought a piece of land in Arizona, I bought 10 acres. I could have bought 40 acres. I could have bought 160. Those were all plots available, and it probably would have been legitimate. But I wanted to have a small enough piece that I could say irrefutably for all time, until the human population gets, ridiculous, who knows, that this is always going to be a reasonable amount of land for me to claim, that I can really say I'm using all of it, right? And I fenced in 10 acres. But if I went to Montana and imagine there was a stateless society, and I went out, I just put up a fence around 1 million acres and said, no, all of this is mine because I put up a fence around it, society would probably say, no, that's not really mixing enough of your labor with the soil to put up a fence around 1 million acres. Now, say I'm an organizer of a company that's going to be farming 1 million acres, and I have investors and employees and equipment and yada yada, and we go and we put up a fence around 1 million acres and say, all right, we are now using this and we have the support and consent of the market. Then that ownership claim is probably going to be respected. So there is a certain amount of subjectivity, and that's why having this as the rule of law specifically is unnecessary and actually contrary to the ideal of market corrections and market incentives for behavior that provides for a range of responses based on the severity of the crime. You might want to shun somebody who didn't violate the non-aggression principle but made themselves such a threat that you just don't want to do business with them anymore, and you might have more problem with a family where someone in the family says, I want to be president, right? And that's the bigger crime than, their 5-year-old kid pickpocketing, a candy bar at the convenience store.
Yeah, but again, I do, and perhaps I'm missing something which you can point out. But again, those they're good points, but they seem to, from my thinking, reinforce my argument somewhat, because again, it shows that we need to have people need to know where they stand. We need to have things established with regards to the fact that you can't just buy up all this land, put a fence around it, claim it yours.
And that's exact. So that is achieved. That spectrum of response is achieved by a whole web of contracts and insurance agreements and community-based social understandings. So you don't need a single thing to do that.
But the problem is then because the market doesn't define morality. I do understand how the market can reinforce certain moralities, but it also can completely ignore them and promote very immoral things. I mean, I know that
the market seeks value. No, it's okay. The market seeks value. We can agree that that's what the market is a mechanism for. That when you allow every individual to be an independent economic actor and make decisions as freely as possible, that they will make the decisions that they perceive as best in their own self-interest, that they will seek value for themselves. And anytime you introduce violence into that system, you simply introduce hamperance or things that hamper the individual ability to seek that fulfillment. So the answer is to have that hive mind, that collective decision making through a voluntary, and of course, the voluntary collective of the entire market. And so if you really believe in this message, if you believe that the non-aggression principle is the representation of true capitalism, that's the ultimate creation of value, then that's fine, because you understand that people seeking value will end up seeking relationships that avoid coercion.
Yeah, I do understand that, but the problem is as I say, that the market value doesn't define morality. And for example, you might see, for example, slavery might not be economically viable, therefore the market helps to get rid of slavery, or it might be economically viable, therefore the market encourages slavery. But the market doesn't decide whether slavery is wrong or not.
No, but I'm saying that morality is included within the market. When you say the market is a mechanism of pursuing value, then you can say that the market naturally pursues beauty over ugliness. The market naturally prefers things that are nutritious over things that are not nutritious. The market naturally promotes things that are moral over things that are immoral, because they're more conducive to human happiness.
I'm not sure I fully agree with that, because I mean I can understand the logic that makes you say that, but I think there are certainly instances and situations and scenarios where that would be true, but I don't think it's an absolute. And I think I know it's hard to judge the market as it's been, because it's always had state interference, so it's never been a truly free market. But I do think that even accepting that caveat, I do believe that we can look at history to show plenty of examples where market forces have encouraged all manner of horrors. Admittedly, government facilitated, but like, you know, if there's you know, people define value in different ways, and we can, you know, and again, that's fine that they can do that, but I think without drawing lines as to where people can step, and just allowing the market to correct people's behaviour, apart from the fact that I from a utilitarian point of view, from a practical sense, I'm not 100% convinced that would work. But even if it was, you know, even if you had a point from the utilitarian point of view, I think from a principle point of view, from a morality point of view, I think it's kind of not betraying the non-aggression principle, but I don't think it is consistent with the non-aggression principle, because the non-aggression principle doesn't define what's right and wrong by what the market encourages or discourages. And I don't think, and I must admit, I do disagree that it's an absolute case. I'm not saying you're saying that, but to clarify, if you are, I do disagree that it's absolute that the market encourages virtuous behaviour, because even though, yeah, it does encourage the pursuit of value, but as I say, for some people who have a certain moral bent, slavery may be economically viable. That may produce value for them, but they shouldn't.
Well, hold on. Anyway. If there's immoral behavior in terms of violating the non-aggression principle as you define it, then it's not the market anyway.
How do you mean, sorry?
If someone's rights are being violated by coercion, if someone's economic right is being interfered with, then you don't have a free market. So okay. A free market is by definition a moral mechanism. There's a moral environment.
Okay, yeah, I accept that. Yeah, no, I do accept that, and yeah, we don't. That's why we've never had a free market, because we've never had a market that's been free of that coercion. As I say, one of the reasons why is because the people that make the rules within the market are a criminal organisation who are themselves violations of the non-aggression principle, i.e., governments for the most part. So yeah, no, I understand what you're saying, but again, I think that's too much of a tenuous and vague situation. Yeah, that is how I would, and it's not just you that defines the free market that way. I would agree with that definition, but what about all the people that don't agree with that definition and you know, view the market as simply, like I say, this is why I think we need to have lines drawn. I think, and it needs to be set, not just something that we, you know, hope enough people will understand within their hearts and be able to articulate within their minds. I think it needs to be set, because otherwise people will stretch interpretations to absurdity, and then you will have people say I don't want to use the child thing again. So, but you will have people stretching what they can do, like with the property rights. Actually, to use your property rights example, the non-aggression principle gives us property rights, as you mentioned yourself. It's a logical progression of self-ownership. You know, you mix your value with resources. You acquire rightful ownership basically through two methods: by either creation or through voluntary trade. Either you create something and then therefore you own it, or you buy it from somebody else who created it, or from someone who bought it from someone. As long as it's voluntary trade, those are two ways that you acquire rightful ownership. And the idea of property rights is very much something that comes from the non-aggression principle. But the non-aggression principle is also something that needs to limit property rights with regards to the fact that you can't, for example, you can't buy up all the land around where I live and imprison me by doing so because I can't trespass on your property. The thing is with owning something is when you own something fully, you have the right to do with it what you will, and you can destroy it if you want. You can do pretty much anything with it if you own it rightfully. Now, the reason why you can't extend that to everything, and this is why this is another point with the non-aggression principle. With the Nations of Sanity, is they do make the point that not everything is up for ownership. Because, for one thing, it's simply not possible to acquire rightful ownership of everything, because we didn't create everything in this world, and we can't buy it off the people who did, because no one did. But also because certain acquiring ownership of certain things would violate somebody else's freedom. And I know it's a rather simplistic example, but to use the example of you just buying up all the surrounding land around me and essentially imprisoning me, because I can't trespass on your property, that's an example where a line needs to be drawn. And I just think that I think that it would be naive to think that we can trust, even when we get to a critical mass of people that's large enough to do what you're proposing with regards to dissolving the federal government. Even with that, I think it would be naive to assume that we can just trust people to understand the non-aggression principle and apply it consistently and negotiate their varying limits of tolerance, which will be different for everybody, when we don't have actually something set that we can all refer to and agree to. I'll put over to you for that.
Well, I mean, I think we've covered the same ground from like every angle possible at this point.
Okay, yeah, I mean, we're not necessarily going to convince each other, but one of the reasons why I wanted to have this debate is obviously I wanted to, present my side of this argument and obviously hear your side of your argument and where we agree and disagree. Even if nothing else, we'll at least understand each other's position better, even if we don't necessarily 100% agree. As you said before, we are on the same page overall with regards to, we're both voluntarists. We're both looking to create a free society. We have a pretty significant disagreement on how we would, with regard. And as I say, I know you don't oppose what I'm suggesting, but you do disagree with my assertion that it's necessary. And as much as I'd like to come to agreement with you, I do still think it is necessary. I do, for the reasons that I've laid out. I do think that it's far too tenuous to just trust people to understand the non-aggression principle, apply it consistently, and that's why I think we need to establish it as law through a peace agreement, and through the three parts of the peace agreement set the lines, the limits of tolerance. Like I say, it's not dictating specifically every little definition, it's just setting the limits so people can still agree to disagree, but this is where you're going too far and this is where we would use force to stop you. I think we need that. I think without that, I honestly don't think we have a free society, and I think the best we could hope for without that would be anarchism. And as much as I have identified as anarchist in the past, I actually think voluntarism is what we should be aiming for, and I do think that this is the difference between anarchism and voluntarism. I think anarchism is just absence of government. I think voluntarism is actually the establishment of a free society, and I think a free society is defined by the non-aggression principle. So that is why I think the only way we can have a free society is to have the non-aggression principle as the law, and that would set the limits to and define everybody's freedom.
All right, well, Matt, I appreciate the opportunity today. I got to go. I got some people waiting for me
I
here.
understand that. I want to say again, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. I know you're very busy, and I'm very grateful that you've taken the time to have this debate. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. I'm glad that you're doing this, and this is going to be on nationsofsanity.com. So I'm glad to contribute to your effort that way, because really it's elevating this conversation to make ethics and voluntarism the end goal. I think really that is what can unite people. So thank you for being a part of that, Matt.
I agree. Thank you very much. Thank you.